Hey everybody, I'm Nick DiMatteo, and welcome to week 183 and video episode number 9 of 4T, the Thursday throwback track. Every week I choose a release from my collection, I discuss it, I give you my take on it, I talk about the history and throw in some other things, and I talk about how it has influenced my music. This week it is the band that you're listening to in the back there, Chicago, with the famous logo. The band's been around for more than 50 years, I believe 53 years now. I looked back on my other 182 posts, and although I mentioned Chicago a couple of times here and there, it surprised me that this is the first time actually talking about this band. They are actually, I would probably say, in my top 5, definitely in my top 10. And you may wonder why. You kind of get an idea of what music I like and I gravitate towards. My tastes are eclectic. I'm into many different kinds of things, but the bands I tend to gravitate to the most are the ones that show range, that show kind of a broadness in what they're willing to try and tackle and accomplish. Bands like the Beatles, bands or artists like Prince and others. Chicago was actually one of those bands. Most of you who know Chicago probably know them because of their big, bad, cheesy power ballad 80s phase, which was a fine phase, or some of their earlier hits like 25 or 6 to 4, Color My World, If You Leave Me Now is a little bit later, but those kinds of hits. What you may not know and what you're hearing in the back, let me give you a 3-second pause, is that they were actually very progressive. They incorporated a ton of styles in their music throughout the years, and even really just early on in their first few albums. I have a list here I'm reading off of what I wrote, and there's jazz, as you can hear. There was classical, blues, funk, there was heavy rock, light rock, progressive rock, pop, folk, political songs, Latin, freeform, spoken word, and even electronic. They did it all. And they did it all pretty much all very well, too. And so that's one of the reasons why Chicago is one of my favorite bands. And really, it's mainly because of what I call their first phase, or their first couple of phases. Thing about a band like this, it's true for a lot of long-term bands, but it's, I think, more true for Chicago than almost any other band. It is that they have gone through many phases, and each of those phases is markedly different, or at least different enough to be considered a different phase. I'm not going to talk about the entire history of the band, because if I did that, it would take me hours. So I'm going to give you kind of a quick rundown of what I consider to be the main phases. We're not talking sub-phases and all that stuff. I could break this down way too much. We're just going to stick to the big chunks. There is Phase 1, which goes from their birth in 1967 as Chicago Transit Authority to 1974. And that goes through their first 7 albums. That was when they were really trying out everything. They were very experimental. As far as I'm concerned, they were a progressive rock band at the time. They certainly, leaned more towards things like jazz and eventually Latin, when they added the Latin percussionist who was a member of theirs for years. Their first 3 albums were double albums. And they decided for their 4th album they should do something different, and they put out a quadruple album. And then the next 2 albums were single albums. Then they did another double album for Chicago 7, and which actually was one of their most progressive and eclectic and instrumentally and weird, electronic albums. So that was, that was the phase that really, I think, kind of captivated my imagination, and that I respect them the most for, because it showed that they were willing to go anywhere and embrace it and mix it together and do their own take on it, Following that was Phase 2. They pretty much sounded the same. They had the same members and all that stuff, but they were getting a little tighter. They were focusing more on singles. They started to have bigger hits, more poppier hits, things like that. They still relied on the same 3 lead vocalist, the incomparable Terry Kath, Robert Lamb, and Peter Cetera. But at this point, the hits that they were getting were leaning more towards having Peter Cetera sing, and that's just something that happened then. And that went through from their Chicago 8 to Chicago 11. And then something happened. Terry Kath died accidentally from playing with a gun. And that completely changed the trajectory of the band for the rest of the remaining members' lives. And this enters into phase 3, which was from 1978 to 1980, from their album Hot Streets, which is number 12. And geez, what a great title. To Chicago 14. They were trying to just stay afloat, just still have a career, just still, try to put out music that they respected. They were really losing their way because they lost their heart and soul, really. And there was a revolving door of, lead guitarists and vocalists who were trying to get to replace Terry Kath. No one quite worked. It took them in interesting directions like disco, or kind of a Cheap Trick kind of sound, like and pop rock and all that kind of thing. They tried to hold on a little bit to that jazzy and horn thing. It's a weird period. There were some very interesting songs in there. There were a couple actual hidden gems, but overall, it's an awkward period. Still worth checking into, although I would not go there first. Phase 4 is the phase everybody knows, from 1982 to 1991, about as long, I think, as the first phase, and I call that the money phase. They got a new producer in David Foster. They started using outside songwriters like Diane Warren to help out. Peter Cetera pretty much took over all the lead vocals. I mean, Robert Land still did some stuff, and they had, a new guy in there and all that, but in general, it was them kind of polishing their jammy jazz funk tendencies into like mass marketable mega hits. They, it might have been that Chicago would have been a band like, I don't know, ELP or somebody like that if they hadn't had that, subsequent 1980 success. And that was probably when I was first conscious of them, because it would have hit me at the right time, right age. And I gotta say, there were songs I played on the piano and sang back then. I probably had to change the key because Peter Cetera has a very high voice, but I loved them, and I don't knock that period, except for one thing, which is this: it was really kind of the linchpin period for them, because after that there was, unfortunately, no going back. There could have been, but there wasn't. They really kind of were looking for a way in phase 3, and in this phase 4. As far as I'm concerned, they kind of lost the original intent of why the band was created. Not live. Live is different. They as far as I know, and I did see them once a couple of years ago, they still kick ass live. But as far as their recording and writing and stuff like that, they never quite went back to this kind of stuff. And for better or worse, my opinion is I'm very sad about that, but other people kind of love it, So that stretched to 91. They were strong enough at that point to weather the departure of Peter Cetera, went on to a big solo career, and the departure of their original drummer, Danny Seraphim, who I've always loved for his energy more than anything else, and his, weirdness in some ways. And just continue to soldier on. And then that took him into phase 5, which, you can break phase 5 down as many phases as you want. As far as I'm concerned, phase 5 is pretty much from their next album in 1995 till now. And the way I see it is they, have been focusing on banking on their legacy, doing great live shows, and continuing to put out albums that people can buy and listen to. I would classify those albums into 3 categories. Unremarkable covers albums, like jazz standards, which for a band that relies on horns and started out so damn jazzy, it really gets me that they don't kind of, get in there and try to get a little more real jazz. And, it's just kind of like jazz. Christmas albums, which, look, I love Christmas. We talked about that when we talked about the Wham album. I have an eclectic taste in Christmas music too, but man, try as I might to like Chicago's Christmas albums, they are so overproduced. And again, you know, horns would be great for holiday music. I don't know why they don't use them more the way they used to, like this. You hear that? Yeah, see. This is Chicago 2 I'm playing, by the way, not, which was this one. And not Chicago 9, which is their first greatest hits compilation. And then the third category of albums that they've been putting out is original music. And God bless them, they're doing what they can, but my God, it's just not been great. And I, again, am sad about that. I don't know why. You know, I think sometimes they think that they can still reach for the heights and get the big hits. And sometimes they try to get a little more personal and things like that. But their sound is so polished now. And their songs rarely venture away from the simple kind of, you know, 3 to 5 minute pop song that I really, you know, it's hard to stay interested. The only time I think they had a bit of a peak was in the late 90s when Lenny Kravitz got a hold of them and they put out these double CD collections of all their stuff and some, you know, B-sides and stuff. And he produced 2 new songs of theirs, which was as close as they've ever come to getting back to this form. And before and since then, in this phase, no, I'm sorry. And I say that because, like with certain relatives we have, no matter how they've changed or who they are, what they go through, you still love them. I still love Chicago. I still listen. I'm going to listen to everything they put out. I have listened to everything they put out. I'll keep hoping that something sparks them to stop trying to be so commercial and get back to their roots. Clearly, they still have the chops, and yeah, they just lost another member. The guy, one of the horn players, retired. You know, so I believe now there are only 3 original members still sticking it out of 7, really, and 8 if you count the Latin percussionist who was with them for a really long time. But they don't seem like they're very interested, and maybe it's because they're road warriors. They just like doing the live thing, and they, you know, kick ass at that. I don't know. All I know is that they still deserve respect and reverence because their first phase and really kind of, and the second phase, I would say too, kicked so much ass, and their fourth phase was such an amazing comeback and you know, and did so much for the power ballad, if you know, love it or hate it, that I'm never not going to love them, and I'm never not going to go back and listen to this. A couple of years ago, I got my son Colin into their music, and he played one of their songs on the drums, and you know, he was listening to them for a while on Spotify, stuff like that. And it's one of the handful of bands that I would love to keep, you know, talking about and passing on. These are the only 2 albums of theirs I have on vinyl. All the other ones I have on CD, which you know, again, except for the last couple, which I've only listened to on Spotify, so I sort of have them, don't have them. I don't even know what, you know, to say about any of that anymore. But because I've listened to them over and over and over and absorbed what they've done, it's clear that they've influenced me just really by default. And I remember producing songs back in college that used keyboard horns because I didn't, you know, have access to horn players. But it was clearly me being Chicago. And throughout, that kind of feeling of being able to do progressive pop music, which is something my friend Daniel Cousins came up with. Progressive pop is, you know, kind of what we both do, but with funky backbeats and layered harmonies. You know, very Beatles influenced, but they went beyond that too. Their harmonies have always been amazing. All of that has been a part of my wheelhouse for years, and their eclecticism and things like that. I can pick a dozen songs of mine that would fit the bill there, but I think the one that came to mind first is from my EP, What It Is. It's the last song called 1 Minute Shy of Forever. You listen to that, you're gonna hear, I mean, it was influenced by a song like Only the Beginning from Chicago's first album, and a bunch of other things. It doesn't have horns, but that's kind of not the point of what their influence was to me. A couple other little notes here before I sign off, and yeah, it's a longer one because it's Chicago, so you know, if I ever do one on the Beatles, it's gonna be longer than this even, so you know, thank you for sticking it out. Terry Kath, my good friend Pete Bradis wrote a book about his guitar heroes, but lesser known guitar heroes. He wasn't writing about Jimi Hendrix or things like that. And he said the person who inspired him to write this book was Terry Kath. And you can hear some of his guitar playing back there. He's someone who Jimi Hendrix said better than him. That's one of the many quotes that has been batted around by his fans. There's a documentary on it if you want to look it up. I took Colin to it a few years ago. It was really good. He's someone who should be better known because he was able to combine the heart and soul and the chops in so many different ways, genres, through his guitar playing. And you can talk about the biggies, and they all deserve our respect too. But somebody like him, I think he should have more recognition. And I guess and then my favorite tracks you're not gonna get because there are way too many. It's like talking about favorite Beatles tracks or favorite Prince tracks. My favorite albums would be Chicago Transit Authority, the first one. 2, which is this, 3, 5, 6, maybe 7 for sure. 8 and 10 were tight, but had some really good stuff on there. 11, I'd give an honorable mention to like 6, as well as I would 16 and 17. They're not going to be in my favorites, but they deserve respect. If you have not listened to any of the 1 through 7 in particular, but even 1 through 11, excluding 4 and 9, which are a live album and greatest hits album respectively, go back and listen to any of this stuff, and you'll understand how the Chicago is not really it's just one version of Chicago. As always, I urge you to read what's below, to click on the link to learn more about Chicago, to click on the link to my song, to listen to it, to share it, to explore further and listen to other of my songs, to discuss what are your thoughts on Chicago. Are there any other 70s progressive rock bands who hit it big in the 80s like Journey or Genesis that you prefer? Or do you hate all of this? Do you love all of it? Do you prefer Chicago's 80s phase to their earlier phases? Do you prefer their current phase for some reason? I want to know all of it because, as always, my objective here in talking about music is conversation and connection. Thanks again for watching. Thanks for listening, and I will see you next week.